morning, everyone. I'm John Shuffle, president of MidTown, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this morning. This is the sixth in MidTown's Community Speaker Series. We have brought, we feel, leading authorities to Columbus to guide us and advise us and help us learn collectively. And today is no exception. We're all in, I think, for a treat. But before we get started with our speaker this morning, I want to recognize a couple of people. First, the Coalition for Sound Growth, our co-sponsor for this series and for today's talk. Virginia Peebles is the head of the coalition, and she's here this morning. Thank you, Virginia, for all that y'all have done to bring today about. We're always pleased to have elected officials participating in these meetings, and today we have Skip Henderson, Pop Barnes, and Mimi Woodson from the council with us. If y'all will stand. Thank you for being here, and we also have candidates for public office who are with us this morning, and I have seen Travis Chambers and Zeph Baker and Bruce Huff and Teresa Tomlinson. Y'all stand. We appreciate what you're doing. I'm sure that all of them would want me to encourage you to vote on November the 30th if you do not vote before then. With no further ado, I would like to call the Reverend Richard Washington, the pastor of St. John's AME Church, to the podium to give us an invocation. Reverend Washington.
Let us pray. Gracious Creator, we are so thankful and blessed to be alive this day. We appreciate your opportunity to take advantage of the most important moments in this life through relationship. Help us seize the moment to create, to cultivate, and to nurture humanity in the direction that you would have us to go. Help us live in excellence and serve humanity to the best of our ability. Bless our sharing with the sweet fragrance of your fellowship, and we certainly are glad to see one another. Help us to have this day be the greatest day we've lived thus far. We give you all of our attention, and we thank you for what you're going to share with us through each speaker and presenter. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Washington. Now I'd like to call David Arrington, the Deputy City Manager, who's going to bring us welcoming remarks on behalf of the City of Columbus, Consolidated Government, and he will be followed by Ann King, the Executive Director of MidTown, who will introduce our speaker this morning.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to bring greetings on behalf of our city, on behalf of our mayor, Jim Worthington, this morning, and city manager, Isaiah Hughley. Our mayor often remarks that we live in a blessed city, and we do. We enjoy a wonderful quality of life. And even in these difficult economic times, our community, unlike many others throughout the nation, is poised for significant growth. Through that, our community has gone through a planning exercise in 2008 where we went out and solicited feedback from citizens in our community through our our council. Our elected officials have approved 3 developments that are using those smart growth principles. And this is in part thanks to organizations like the Coalition for Sound Growth through the leadership of Virginia Peebles and MidTown Incorporated through Ann King and her staff that bring distinguished national speakers to our community to share thoughts and ideas. We're extremely fortunate today to have a speaker that literally wrote the book on smart growth. He did write the book on smart growth, and it'll be for sale right outside on your way out. But Jeff Speck is certainly an expert in this field. His day is only beginning. He has agreed to meet with our city planning and engineering staff and other members of our city staff later today and spend several hours with us sharing his thoughts and ideas. And for that, Jeff, we certainly appreciate it. We welcome you to Columbus, and we certainly look forward to your message this morning. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. This is really exciting, and I think the audience deserves a round of applause for caring about how our city grows, being interested in hearing progressive new ideas and fresh vision for how we grow into the future, and for getting up and being here at this early hour in order to do it. So thank you all. I, too, would like to thank the Coalition for Sound Growth, our co-sponsor today. And I'd also like to thank our benefactors who are making this event possible, the Flint Energies Foundation and the Fifth Generation Bradley Turner Fund, for their support of today's program. Virginia's already raised her hand from the Coalition for Sound Growth, and Candace Wayman, where are you, Candace? Would you raise your hand? And I would like to thank our MidTown staff, Leslie Ann Hurd, Director of Programs, who has worked tirelessly for the better part of a month to make this wonderful event happen. So, Leslie Ann, would you raise your hand? And Judy Tucker, our Director of Community Affairs. Judy, where are you? There you are, back at the MidTown Business Association table. And for all of your work for this and all the events that have been going on in the last couple of months at MidTown. And for our MidTown board, would all of our board members raise your hands, please? I just want everyone to recognize you, the leadership of MidTown's organization to sustain and enhance the neighborhoods and businesses within Midtown Columbus. I met Jeff Speck this summer in Atlanta when I had the opportunity to attend the Congress for the New Urbanism. And if you don't know what the CNU is, it is a worldwide organization dedicated to building more livable communities. And I heard Jeff do a lecture for 1 hour, and then he was doing a full-day seminar the next day, and I enjoyed his lecture so much that I signed up for the full-day seminar. So I've had the opportunity to spend a day and a half with Jeff. And what can I tell you about Jeff that wasn't written on your invitation in the formal biography that was listed there? He earned degrees at Williams, Harvard, and Syracuse University in art history and architectural design. He's worked as an investment banker. He was director of town planning at the leading new urbanist firm of Duany Plater-Zyberk in Miami, Florida. That he served as director of design for the National Endowment for the Arts. That he's the father of 2 children, aged 2 and 5 months. That he's the co-author of 2 books, Suburban Nation and the Smart Growth Manual. And I'm going to leave you with a helpful hint, a discovery that I made. This serves dual purposes. It's not only a dandy handbook to keep on your desk, but it's the best mouse pad you will ever invest in. So this is what I use for my mouse pad. And now I will turn our program over to our guest, Jeff Speck. Join me in welcoming Jeff to Columbus.
Good morning. I think I'm hot. I've got 2 mics on, one for the camera, one for you, so I don't have to stand at the podium. Also, I have to say I had a coffee accident at the table this morning, and I know this is being filmed and the camera can zoom in, and this will probably end up on YouTube. So I want it to be clear that I do prepare well for my trips and pack clean clothes, but it just didn't work out that way. I do have a few people I really do want to thank, especially MidTown Inc., of course, and the Coalition for Sound Growth for bringing me here. But I've been treated really so warmly, and we spent hours touring around yesterday with Ann King and Leslie Ann Hurd and others, showing me a lot of your city, and I'm grateful for that, and also grateful for the home southern hospitality of John and Lucy Sheftel, who welcomed me to the Cedars, and it's nice, let's just say it beats the Courtyard Marriott, which is my normal place to stay. But I was treated to a delicious meal. I don't think it's available anywhere else, with the slightly worrisome cannibalistic name of Country Captain. But it was fantastic, and I think it was chicken, so I'm grateful for that. And they gave me the rest. I have the recipe right here to bring home to because I really did enjoy it. I have a lot to. Oh, I need my advancer. Thank you very much. Could we bring the lights down if that's all right? I have a lot to tell you today, so I'm going to talk really fast. I thought kind of long and hard about. I'm handled to a different extent by different people who bring me in to speak, but I did have some lengthy conversations with Anne, and she made me earn this by really thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about. And unfortunately, I hadn't been here before I put this together, so it couldn't be as specific. I don't have pictures of your own community, et cetera. It couldn't be as specific as I might have liked, but I really wanted to try to address in my own way the title that I was given, which is the City Livable Community Revitalization the Smart Growth Way. And I hope that this lecture fulfills that goal. But it has a couple other names that I could give it. Basically, whenever I go to a place, there's a certain amount of stuff that I feel I need to convey because there's a message of smart growth that I'm spreading around the country, around the world, really, if I can. I have to say it's very confusing. I'm in Columbus today. Last week I was in Columbia, the country, speaking to the National Association of Realtors. And in fact, my plane yesterday from Atlanta, they made the wise decision of loading Columbus and Columbia next to each other at the same time. So you're lucky I'm here. I'm here today. But there's certain things that I've learned over the years that we're just not doing very well in our cities that we need to do better. And I try and say those things wherever I go. And then finally, in terms of a framework, so you can understand what how this talk is organized, it's really about 8 different ways of planning, and it's almost in a sense a nonlinear, loose history of how we have planned and do plan our communities, and what we've learned from doing that. So without further ado, so I'm a city planner, which means I do 2 types of work. I work on the improvement of existing places, like South Beach in Miami, where I lived for a decade. And I work on the design of new places, like Kentlands outside of Washington, where I was assistant town architect when I was in school, and now I live not too far from there in the District of Columbia. But I'm also, as Anne suggested, I'm a member of the Congress for New Urbanism. I'm a proud, card-carrying, actually founding member of this organization. And as a new urbanist, what that means is that actually we study the old places. We measure them. How far apart are the curbs? How far apart are the trees? How tall are the buildings? What's their relationship to the street? Where does the parking go? We study these older places in order to do a better job of creating newer places. And new urbanists really try to invent as little as possible. The way we used to plan communities that's worked so well for us over the generations, we know that that's a successful model. And we only change it as much as we need to take advantage of modern conveniences, but we don't let modernity allow us to reinvent the city, which is the error that was made in the second half of the 20th century. This is our book, Suburban Nation, which, is this one also for sale today? Or just, okay, this one's also out back. So there'll be a book signing after this, and I should say this now, and you can decide later, if you enjoy what I have to say and you feel that this is a message that you want to be able to spread yourself, that's why these books were written. There's 2 of them. I'll be showing you the other one. Suburban Nation just celebrated its 10th anniversary. It sold 100,000 copies. It's called the Smart Growth Bible. It was called actually the Urbanist's Bible by the Wall Street Journal. I regret to say that was in an article against urbanists, but by Fred Barnes, who some of you may know. But it's been acknowledged as the most influential book of this movement, and it was created to convince people. It didn't convince Fred Barnes. But if you find this argument compelling and you want to be able to make it yourself, this is the book for you as a tool. So I spent 10 years with my co-authors, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and I'm here today because I'm willing to travel a lot more than they are. We worked together for a decade, as I said, and they are really the heroes and the founders of this movement. And those of you who have heard, has anyone here heard Andres or Liz speak? Oh, good, so you'll think this is all my stuff. But I've stolen all of this from them. But after working with them for a decade and writing the book, it got the attention of the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, under President Bush, whose name was Dana Gioia. And he hired me to be the director of design at the NEA. And I had the great experience of, I know the mayoral candidates are in the room. The Mayor's Institute on City Design was one of the programs I got to run. And that program, every 2 months, somewhere in America, we bring together 8 mayors, 8 designers. We lock ourselves in a room for 3 days, and we try to solve that city's most pressing urban design problem that the mayor picks. So where do I put my convention center? How do I reconnect to my waterfront? Issues like that, and they would be solved behind these closed doors. No media, no constituents. A lot of things are said in those rooms that can't be discussed publicly, and that's why they're such valuable workshops. Columbus is certainly a city of the size that would be appropriate. So whoever becomes the new mayor, please inquire at the National Endowment for the Arts about participating in this program. I bring it to your attention to encourage your mayor to go, but also because I was able then for 4 years, every 2 months, to pick my favorite designers. And by designers, I mean designers, developers, architects, starchitects, because there's 2 different things, architects and starchitects, landscape architects, traffic engineers, preservationists, all the people who come together to make communities. And I would get to pick the best ones from the whole country and got to meet so many of them. And I stole their slides, too. So so what I'm presenting to you today is the kind of the best of the best that I've learned from these people as well as from my old colleagues. I'm not going to get into that. There's the Smart Growth Manual, which is in contrast to Suburban Nation. This isn't meant to convince you of anything. It's meant to help you to do it. It is a manual. Every page is just a picture, a caption, an instruction, and a little paragraph. For example, about providing parallel parking along the curb to protect the sidewalk. Simple things like that. But if you add them all up, they tend to be the things that cities get wrong. And there's 148 points that make up the book. So I think particularly if you are somehow related to the creation of community or perhaps judging the creation of community and deciding whether plans that are proposed are actually smart growth, this book would be useful to you. I'm invited, now we're getting into the subject matter, I'm invited to a lot of places through an organization called CEOs for Cities. And CEOs for Cities has as its membership a lot of city leaders, a lot of foundations. They're very well funded because a lot of foundations belong, wealthy individuals, people who really want to see their cities thrive. And they're brought in, CEOs for Cities are brought in essentially to do the programming half of making a city work. How large should my convention center be? What sort of events should I be having to draw people to my community? And the question that they're usually given is, superficially, how can I make my city thrive? Deeper down, what they're being told, particularly by the very wealthy people who often bring them in, like the billionaires from Grand Rapids, how can I keep my children from leaving? How can I keep my grandchildren from leaving this community and wanting to stay here? And so we talk about the stuff that makes cities attract younger people who are the engines of entrepreneurship. The 80% of the millennials decide first where they want to live, and then they look for a job. So it's so much about place and wanting to be in a place. And the things the millennials like are the things that the empty nesters also like, and they're also you want in your community because they have more money to spend, right? As well as families. But a lot of cities are focused now on attracting free-moving millennials, free radicals, millennials and empty nesters. And they bring me in because they've realized that physical design is a huge part of this discussion. You can do all you want in terms of programming. It's like designing a house. Well, I want to have 4 bedrooms, or I want to have 1 bedroom, whatever you've decided. But then how are they arranged? And if things are not arranged properly in relationship to each other, or if you can't create street life, this is an exaggeration. This is a sort of event that in Grand Rapids that CEOs for Cities creates, but that's on a special occasion. But if you can't create this everyday hustle and bustle, that people look to New York or Chicago or other of our larger cities to provide, then you're not necessarily going to attract the groups you want to attract. And that's all about framing the public realm in a way that it is conducive to this sort of activity. And that's my specialty. So I'm going to talk very quickly about 8 ways that we can plan our future. And planning is always about the future. In a sense, the definition of planning is you're looking ahead. And I'm going to talk to you about planning for health, planning by zoning, planning by coding, planning by engineering, planning by and for driving, planning for health now, planning for climate change, and planning for walkability. very quickly. So planning for health is the formative act of the planning profession. Planners didn't used to exist. There was no one called planners. But at a certain point, people realized that we were suffering because of our proximity and our integration with the dark satanic mills of Europe. So in London and in Manchester and Paris and other cities, people were really sickened by this isn't fog, this is just the dirt and the dust and the fumes coming from having manufacturing mixed in with housing, and the idea of moving out into the country, into the periphery, and separating ourselves from these places was the glorious formative act of the planning profession, because lifespans actually increased by 5 or 10 years in a very limited period of time. And the planners were hailed as heroes, and from then on, they tried to repeat that great victory, essentially by separating everything from everything else. So zoning has become the kind of key activity that planners create and that planners partake in, and zoning means that you lay out different areas on a map, and just as you separated industry from housing, now we're going to separate larger houses from smaller houses, from apartments, we're going to separate medical offices from offices, and we're going to create these large areas on maps. Whenever you see a plan like this, and I see them in every community I go to, all you've essentially guaranteed is what we call a suburban sprawl outcome. Because if you have large areas of single use and very few roads connecting them, you have the model of sprawl, which is a big road. Since there's only one, it has to be big. And then the inability to walk from thing to thing because each thing is so big and far apart from other things. So this model of zoning became really the dominant act of planners for many years. And you see here there's a whole series of professions, from home building, from development to home building to lending, that have organized themselves around this. So if we were to have put one of these $400,000 houses in the $300,000 cluster, it would have been very difficult to finance, for example. So the whole system of production and finance has now been oriented around this. And of course, there's the other model. And this is the Suburban Nation story. We're telling the story. It's a bit oversimplified, but it's effective, and it's ultimately true, that there are really only two ways to build community. And since 8,000 years ago, when we built Jericho, the first non-nomadic human settlement, we've had what's called the neighborhood, and what I call the traditional neighborhood. And the traditional neighborhood is defined, this is Newburyport, Massachusetts, you're actually looking at several neighborhoods, but the traditional neighborhood is defined as being diverse, compact, and walkable. And so you have places to worship, places to work, places to recreate, places to live. Every aspect of daily life is within walking distance. And that's the diversity of the form and the use of the city. It's walkable because there are lots of streets, and every street is small. So we're not concentrating traffic essentially on highways within our community. And it's compact in the sense that if you study any community across the globe, frankly, and across history, they almost all have neighborhoods that are, I'll think about a city we both might know, which is New York. And there's Tribeca and Soho and the East Village and the West Village. And all of these neighborhoods tend to be about a 5-minute walk from edge to center, which means they're a half mile across. And conveniently, the Jeffersonian grid, which marched across this nation, is mile squares that are then subdivided again into four neighborhoods per mile. And then you see, when you go to communities, you can often identify individual neighborhoods as that size. So it's a well-established model, but it was not invented. It's something that developed naturally in response to man's needs. And here's a diagram that was done initially in the teens, but then kind of resuscitated by my colleagues Andres and Liz, showing the neighborhood structure with a clear edge, a clear center, a mix of uses, many blocks, many streets, and the idea that it can be accumulated. So one can stand alone as a village, several can come together, or many more as a town, and then when they become vertical and more intensely used, they're a city. And those are the two models. You can see the difference between them. And here's a more recent diagram showing that it's the same stuff, right? The sprawl model on the left has places to go to school and shop and work and recreate, but they're all big and they're all separated and they're connected by only one road, and that road becomes the highway. Whereas the traditional neighborhood, they're organized like confetti. That's so important. So Sprawl is easy to analyze and discuss because it's made of very few distinct components. And each one is a monoculture. There are places where you only live, places where you only work. So it isn't just this map I showed you, right? I mean, it's much more intense than that because the areas can be much larger and much further apart from each other. So places where you only live, places where you only work outside of Washington, places where you only shop, the big box zoo, the latest version. And then public institutions, which tend to be supersized because this whole mentality of having bigger things further apart from each other. So you get the high school that you can tell by the sheer size of the parking lot to which no student has ever walked, will ever walk. Busing isn't even efficient because the students of this school are so far flung in these dead-end subdivisions, right, that surround it. This is in South Florida. And then other public institutions like sports fields. This is why we have the soccer mom and the soccer dad in this country. Where were they when I was growing up? Well, I could walk to the one baseball diamond that was in my neighborhood. But now we have 4, 6, 8 together, and you can see that's a street surrounding it that you don't want your kid bicycling on. So everyone has to take their kids everywhere because that's the way we've built our communities. And the one piece of this puzzle that was never properly counted when they did the math was the amount of roads it would take. If we separate everything from everything else on the presupposition of one car per adult and the fact that everyone's going to drive everywhere, then all of a sudden we load up our streets and our highways to an unprecedented degree. And the interstate highway system, which was created for commerce and for vacation travel and for nuclear evacuation, frankly, it's true, has instead become a commuter. It's become a commuter way. I lived in 3 different places on the East Coast where I drove I-95 to get to work, and that's how we live now. So I always tell people, this model, which wasn't something that developed naturally, but was in fact a post-war invention, this single-use sprawl model, you can have it, but understand it's a 2-part deal. And if you want one of these, you have to have the other. And then there's this really strange development where this is like Oscar Mayer. This is just Chevron. Right? This is like Oscar Mayer having an ad where the lady says, "No more hot dogs for me, thanks." Right? I mean, they're advertising to stop using their own product. But the point is, all this momentum we're trying to generate to change our lifestyles to be more sustainable. Well, if she lives here, how is she going to leave the car at home? And what this whole campaign doesn't understand is that we've created a national landscape where this sort of reforming our behavior isn't possible. And so much of America, really the majority of America geographically, is this model and not the neighborhood model anymore. So when you're doing zoning, there's another half to that puzzle, which is, yes, we've separated everything from everything else, but what form are those pieces going to take? And that's planning by coding. We have codes that determine the form of our buildings. They look like this. They're thick and they're onerous, and they often deal with issues that are hard for people to understand because they're just numerical and technical. This is my house, which I show because by the end of these shows, people often think that I only enjoy traditional architecture and that I somehow hate modern architecture. And this is my own house that I designed. But when I built this, I had one of these. I had, I think, this code that I had to deal with, which said certain things like, even though I was 3 blocks from metro rail and many buses, and bicycling is my main way around town, and we didn't own a car, I needed to have a garage in my house. And I had to, and even though none of my neighbors in this historic neighborhood had a garage, so I had to fight for 9 months to not remove an on-street parking space, cut a driveway, and put a garage in my house. And that's what these codes are telling us. But they also deal with issues like FAR, floor area ratio, which is how form is controlled in a way that bears no relationship really to how the building behaves in a city. Floor area ratio is the ratio of the amount of interior space to the size of the lot, and that's what most cities are looking at. But it doesn't care about what matters. So, for example, this is an FAR of 2.0, the infamous dingbat apartments of Los Angeles, probably the worst urban form possible in terms of walking past a building. This is also a FAR of 2.0 in the wonderful neighborhoods of Birmingham, Alabama. This is an FAR of 1.0, the kind of environment that you flee as soon as you've cut your car engine, right? And this is an FAR of 1.0, a development we built outside of Atlanta called Post Riverside. This is an FAR of 0.75, suburbs outside of Toronto. We call it the Snout House, right? And this is an FAR of 0.75, suburbs outside of Toronto, a new development that we built. So it's clear that we need to be controlling, if we're going to control the form of our buildings, we need to control it in a way that's different from FAR. But certainly the lesson that we've learned is that planning by zoning and planning by coding equals planning to fail. And this is a piece that I gave in a lecture to the 750 Canadian planners who came to their national conference. But I was talking about the American example, and this is where I started whistling. So these are some. I'm going to start whistling in a minute, but these are some images that this artist has taken of planning boards in action. I'm sorry, I forget the artist's name. And I've juxtaposed that by a series of photos, many of them by Alex McLean, of the outcomes of that. So here's the American story. Anyway, you get the idea. I've gone beyond my whistling range. But these are the, it's funny, but it's just so sad that this regime that we've set up, where these are hardworking people, they're typically volunteers, they're no dummies, but working in this system that they have been given to work with, these are the outcomes that are being generated by that activity. So I think most of us agree that the system as it exists now is broken. And in fact, what's really interesting is the entire leadership of the planning associations, the Urban Land Institute, which is the developers' think tank, certainly the leading epidemiologists and thinkers on all of these subjects understand that this is a broken system. That doesn't mean that we've stopped doing it. And I think you have ample evidence around here that the momentum, even in these economic times, the momentum towards creating these places is continuing. And it's like the captain of the Titanic. He spotted the iceberg, and the engines are in full reverse, but it takes a long time to turn that ship around. And we're actually glad, we're all suffering, all of us, particularly planners, in this economy, but we're glad that we've had this respite, that we're having this respite of less development, because we hope that, as we step back and think about the mistakes we've made in how we've financed our communities, we also need to pay attention to how we've designed them, and that it's time to change that just as deeply as we need to change the financial system. So planning by engineering is the other part of separating everything from everything else, and I talked about all the roads that are necessary, but when designing the roads becomes, when the roads become the principal complaint, when a city manager or a city planner asks his people or her people, what is your complaint, and they say traffic, then the whole system, and that's the first thing you hear, because this system is designed to choke on traffic, extremely spread out. If you have to drive everywhere, it's designed to choke on traffic. Then the question becomes, how can we solve the traffic problem? We add lanes and we add lanes, and somehow, these will be the pyramids of the 23rd century, right? Los Angeles and other places. But we keep adding lanes, and we don't find that it's solving the problem. And there's actually a reason for that. And this is one of the points that I struggle to share with every community that I'm in, because the intellectuals know it, and even most of the practitioners know it, but it's not acted upon, is this concept of induced demand. And that this is what typically happens in any community. There's a forecast that roadways need to widen because traffic is increasing, and maybe we're here, and so this is the traffic that we're experiencing. And so the decision is made to widen the road, and what happens is more people choose to drive. And there's a long explanation for this, and if some of you want to take an hour and sit with me after this, we'll go through all the reasons why this happens. But there's essentially this demand, induced demand, which is the amount that people would choose to drive more if their traffic was reduced. And people make trips or choose not to make trips based on the perception of how much traffic they're going to encounter. They also make decisions like, how far will I live from my office? Or, boy, that house that's 20 minutes further away from work has really sexy bathrooms, and it's easy to get there, so I'm just going to move there. And the experience, the great contrast there is Atlanta versus Portland, where Atlanta, through the 70s and 80s, Atlanta pretty much doubled its highway miles, and Portland created an urban growth boundary and invested in transit. And what they accomplished in Atlanta was they lengthened the average commute from 20 minutes to 40 minutes. And what they accomplished in Portland is actually people drive less now in Portland than they did in 1970. So that's the outcome of creating more roadways, is you just induce more demand. And everyone knows this now. This is from Newsweek magazine, where it says, building more roads, that's expensive, and demand from drivers tends to quickly overwhelm the new supply. Today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. Unfortunately, these are not the engineers that I deal with daily. These are just engineers who lead the profession, but a lot of engineers went to school a long time ago, and they're not necessarily aware of this. So the catchy way to say it is trying to cure traffic congestion with more capacity is like trying to cure obesity by loosening your belt. That's a bit rude, but it's the exact same mechanism at work. You allow something to happen that couldn't happen otherwise. And then the traffic planners are like, whoa, you know? Or they say, actually, I told you so. I told you that we need this new road. Look how choked in traffic it is. But it's the new road that's created that new traffic. The British know this. Many years ago, they stopped building new roads in England. And new roads can cause traffic jams. We're slowly catching up. And then there's the complete misinformation that you see, and this is a firm that I've worked with from time to time, in Planning Magazine, saying vehicle miles traveled increased by 97% from 1980 to 1996. And if we only improve the infrastructure improvements could significantly reduce the $78 billion of fuel lost to congestion each year. So here they're saying the solution to congestion and all that waste is to build more roads, when supposedly we know that that's not true. But this is still the stuff you hear. So I'm here to share that with you. And so we just build more and more gold-plated horizontal infrastructure, ignoring the quality of our vertical infrastructure like schools and other public, city halls, and putting all our money into this just to allow ourselves to drive more and further and to experience this frustration. And this is not Photoshop. This is an actual light outside of Orlando. I thank Walter Kulash for the slide, but there's a reason for this. It's just not worth getting into. And then in addition to more roads, we create wider roads, and ever wider. The standards keep increasing because if we're stuck in congestion, which actually, congestion is the outcome not of lane widths, but of what's happening in intersections. But if we widen the lanes, maybe people could move a little more smoothly, so you have the, what we call the road so wide you can see the curvature of the earth, which is leading to a little housing subdivision. And here are two images up above Rockville, Maryland, one from the 70s and one from the 90s, but these are surprisingly taken from the same height. And look at the width of the roads. Look at the width of the roads in the 70s subdivision and the width of the roads in the 90s subdivision. So the standards of my staff always sticks this somewhere in my slideshow. I'm sorry. So the standards, it's an ongoing joke. The standards keep changing, and this is my neighborhood in Miami, where they had to fix the curbs for stormwater, and they had to fix them to the new standards. So even though South Beach, this wonderful neighborhood, was functioning perfectly well, no one was trapped on these supposedly narrow streets. Now a 6-foot sidewalk has become a 3-foot sidewalk because of this new standard. And of course, people drive faster on these streets, and luckily a number of communities, this is actually Birmingham, Michigan, but a number of communities, grassroots efforts, the citizens are rising up and saying, let's bring our streets back to reasonable widths, and you have things like Portland's Skinny Street program, the kind of streets that we all grew up on that are now illegal. And this is a big part of what we're trying to do as well. And then the idea about, actually, let me see where I'm going here. And then the idea about the width of the lanes and how those impact our safety in different communities. And the fact that the most dangerous intersections, of course, are the ones that correspond perfectly to the Department of Transportation requirements. And as the roads get wider, and frankly, the buildings pull further back, and they do pull further back because the roads are noxious, drivers go faster and faster. Here you see the tremendous difference between a 30-mile-an-hour and a 45-mile-an-hour speed, and we were driving 45 on our way in here this morning because that was the natural speed to go on these community streets because of how they felt. And the difference to a pedestrian is life and death. So, what can you do about that? And part of that is just to post speed limits. There's this whole movement in England called 20 is Plenty. That's a huge grassroots movement where for entire neighborhoods within the city and for some smaller cities, for the entire downtown, they're posting a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. But drivers, particularly European drivers, don't necessarily follow speed limits. We drive the speed at which we feel safe, not at the speed at which we're told to drive. And So, how can you design communities actually so that people will drive a little bit slower? And it has to do with having the lanes the right width and confusing intersections like this intersection in Stuart, Florida, where my old partners were brought in to fix it because it was a nightmare. But in fact, it was the safest such intersection. It was the safest high-volume intersection in South Florida because it was 7 roads, a railroad track. No one knew what to do. They were scared. And they drove much more slowly. And this is where this belongs, in contrast to the conventional. And people are always wondering, because the reason I bring this up is most places where I work, it's illegal to make complex intersections. You have to have 90-degree angles. You can't have staggers. You can't have cranks and other things that make for great communities. So I always point to this chart of Sweden. And we know, seat belts were introduced and airbags were introduced. But what happened in 1966, 67, that caused that one year to drop? And what it was they'd switched from driving on the left-hand side of the street to driving on the right-hand side of the street. So the fear and the confusion caused by changing their entire traffic patterns, principal outcome was to save lives. So based on this, we should actually switch every year back and forth, and we'd save millions of, thousands of lives. But just so you know who to trust and what to think about conventional wisdom, this quote, "The possible benefits of required seatbelts would not justify the costs to the manufacturers and the public." Was this GM saying this? No, it was the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in 1970. So, thinking evolves, we learn new things, and we just need to act upon those things to improve our community. And just the idea that we're now a society of specialists, and someone's specialized in the width of the roads, and someone's specialized in making sure that in the 100-year storm that road is dry in 10 seconds. But you can't let anyone, and when I lecture to mayors, I always say, Mayor, your job is to be the generalist, because everyone's going to tell you that they need something that's special for them, but in fact, only generalists can design cities, because cities have to work for all of us. So this is a fun series of slides of what's happened to our society because we've been planning around the automobile and the expectation of automobile ownership. And I actually got these slides from Howard Frumkin. And Howard Frumkin is an epidemiologist who goes around the country lecturing on how we design our communities impacts our health. And he says, what if in America we were asked to design, what if our goal, what if the federal government had said, design your communities so that no one will ever choose to walk? What would we do? And the answer is, well, you'd of course have the streets with no sidewalks, plenty of those here, as there are elsewhere. The street edge where there is a sidewalk, but you can't get the stroller on it. The sidewalk that exists, but it's just so close to such a fat roadway that no one ever would choose to take it, an unprotected sidewalk. Or you just put the pole in the middle of the sidewalk. What the heck? When the sidewalk becomes decoration, there's no reason to actually have it work. The sidewalks that end or the sidewalks that pass in the night. Or just say it, no pedestrians, because that's what's happening anyway. And so we've created this whole society built around driving, and the drive-in grocery store, and the drive-in bakery, the drive-in flowers, liquor store is something you find a lot in the South, and in Florida where I lived, the drive-through liquor store always worries me. And then, every aspect of life. You can get married in your car. When it doesn't work out, you can pay child support in your car. And as you get older, pharmacy and even the mortuary that you can drive through. I've never really understood this one exactly, but you get the idea. But then that gets into the whole society we've created and the health problems and the fact that we no longer have a reason to live actively, and that's the other half. Or that's a big half of the epidemiology discussion. And so we have planning for health, which started the planning profession, but we have planning for health now. And planning for health now is outlined in this great book. It's a textbook, but it reads very well by Howie Frumkin, also Larry Frank and Dick Jackson, that points out all the different ways that we're actually killing ourselves with the design of our communities. And increased air pollution and asthma, traffic injuries, of course, decreased physical activity, heat island effects, income segregation, which is social segregation, which creates decreased social capital, negative mental health impacts, et cetera. The correlation of asthma in cities to where the highways are located. Lots of discussion. And USA Today very surprises me with the number of articles it has that discuss issues like this. and then the whole child obesity epidemic, which is probably the biggest challenge we face physically in the country. It says, remember when we used to have to fatten the kids up first? And it's humorous, but we're now looking at 1/3, according to the National Centers for Disease Control, we're looking at 1/3 of all Americans born after 2000 being diabetics. And diabetes currently consumes 2% of our GNP. So it's a hugely expensive disease, vastly proliferating disease. And part of it is our completely misguided national policy regarding how we produce food. And if any of you have seen, read The Omnivore's Dilemma or seen the movie King Corn, about how, 25% of our corn is going towards sweeteners and 75% is going towards essentially cows 3 times as fat as they should be, and making meat much less healthy than it should be. I think the biggest problem our country faces before suburban sprawl is our food policy. But that's not my specialty. My specialty is suburban sprawl. So we'll talk about the other aspect of that. And, it's calories in, but it's also calories out. And the fact that we've eliminated the useful walk and the useful bike from our lives is one of the problems. Bowling Alone, a great book about how you can, this statistician, Robert Putnam, essentially discovered that he could correlate people's commuting length with the number of community organizations that they belong to, inverse proportion, and how basically the time we spend in cars is eroding our communities. And then this idea about income-based segregation. And we don't think twice when we drive down the street and we see signs like this. But what if they were more straightforward and told us what we were really doing to our society? These slides also from Howard Frumkin. This should concern us that we're atomizing more than we ever have in our history by very precise segments of income generation. And then, so as we start to talk about the need for solution, the one crisis that you hear about first is health, and the second one you hear about is climate change and the amount of carbon we're putting into our atmosphere. And even if you don't believe in climate change, certainly putting all that pollution into our atmosphere is not a good thing for us or for the planet. I do worry as I speak about this in more conservative parts of the country. I saw this bumper sticker in Vermont, so I'm not here necessarily as an environmentalist, but I do personally. I'm not going to say I believe. It is patently clear to any scientist that deserves certification that we are causing global warming, and it is a problem. And we know the outcomes of that over time. And this is my old neighborhood of Miami Beach, and my house is somewhere in the blue area. When the oceans rise 5 feet, that's going to be our landscape. And of course, more to the point and more immediately is what we're already seeing is the generation of greater storm activity. I had the displeasure of visiting Mississippi and New Orleans after Katrina and witnessing that with a bunch of mayors. And if we are going to do something about limiting, as we work to limit the amount of pollutants that we put in the atmosphere, there's a couple really interesting facts. One is that independent of automobile use, you can see here in this USA Today, New York Times chart, that a single-family house is generating twice as much greenhouse gases as an apartment in a multifamily unit. Think about it. When your apartment leaks air conditioning, you're essentially cooling your neighbor. But in the middle of the countryside, you're cooling just the air around your house. So there's an efficiency to density that's an important thing to think about as we try to reduce our footprint. But then if you look at the CO2 per household from automobile use, it's really funny. Environmentalists used to think that the cities were the evil thing because the CO2 per square mile, of course, was higher in the cities than it was in the country. But then someone had the bright idea of saying, let's look at it per person or per household. And what happens when you flip it to per household, this happens to be Houston. But if you go to the website for CNT, I think it's cnt.org, Center for Neighborhood Technology, you find that every city has a map like this, where if you're in the center city or even in these wonderful inner ring suburbs, like I've heard of one called MidTown, for example. If you're in one of these inner ring suburbs, you're actually generating 1/4, typically, the amount of CO2 from auto use than if you're in an outer ring suburb. So that's a huge thing, and it actually has a greater impact than your house. The greatest way that, transportation is only a part of our contribution to climate change, but for the typical American, that's the way that we contribute personally the most is by driving around. And so if you can find a way to have one less car per family, actually the pleasure of living in a place where you can walk to stuff, that's how that has, actually, the studies show that has 50 times the impact of changing all your light bulbs. So please do change all your light bulbs to the energy savers, but if you really want to have an impact that makes that one statistically insignificant, then try and live with one fewer car. And here's the great map that advocates for density. It shows how in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago, as the households per acre increase, the vehicle miles traveled drops off very quickly. What's interesting is that between, even 10 units per acre, which is a nice row house density, and 200 units per acre, it's not that much of a difference, because that's when you get into walkability. It's really the change from 10 units per acre to 1 unit per 5 acres, for example, where the big impact occurs. And so we don't need necessarily, and what this map tells us is we don't need super dense cities to accomplish this. We just need nice urbanism. If you have single-family houses that lead to row houses that lead to a center that has apartments, then you're accomplishing you're reaching a very nice point in that chart. And that is the traditional American neighborhood. This is handled very well. If you want to learn more about this, the book Green Metropolis that came out last year by David Owen makes a very compelling case and a surprising case about why Manhattan is the greenest community in the U.S. And if you look at the per capita contribution of each resident, it is. But the argument I would make is you don't have to go that far to have a profound impact. And so the alternatives to driving everywhere, living at densities, and living in a neighborhood organization where transit works again, and where biking works. And what we're learning as we look at American cities, and not just New York, is that the introduction of bicycle facilities is pulling all these bikers out of the woodwork. In New York, in 1 year, they increased the amount of biking by 35%, just in 1 year, by doing this, by putting bike paths in, bike lanes in, and making it clear that bikers were welcome. And I tell cities, because often my client in a city is the city, and I say you're competing for millennials and for young people for whom car ownership isn't the cool thing it once was. Biking is definitely the cool thing to be doing. It isn't just that you want to make it possible for people to make this choice, but these green stripes in your streets are an advertisement that say, young people are welcome here. Young, hip, innovative people are wanted in this city because we're going to advocate for biking. And these are some pictures that my friends who live in Portland sent me. And I asked them, I said, was this bike to work day, or what was this? They said, no, it was Tuesday. But this is just normal commuter, bike crowding in cities like Portland. And frankly, in Washington, D.C., we've started to experience the same thing. And then ultimately, though, in terms of transportation, there's driving, transit, biking, always getting better. But what if we didn't have to move at all? And I was going to write an article called Against Mobility until I saw that Lewis Mumford had written a similar article about 100, maybe 80 years ago, that we're mistaken. We're confusing means for ends when we think that the objective should be to move people around. The goal should be to create communities in which the least amount of motion accomplishes your daily needs. So this is our neighborhood. This is my wife when our first son was born, walking around our neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where you have the apartments, the shops, the grocery store, everything that you need close at hand. And of course, it's a luxury. And frankly, in some cities, it's an expensive luxury to be able to live this way, where mobility is less necessary. So my point is that planning for health and planning for climate equals planning for walkability. And here in this final section of my talk, I'm just going to very quickly run through what I've come up with, and this is actually the basis for the next book, which I just got my contract on, which is going to be called Walkable Cities. And it's about this general theory of walkability I have that isn't mine alone, but I've developed it from working with a lot of different people and finding people walking in areas where you wouldn't think they would and saying, what are the conditions that are causing this to happen? So how do you get people to walk? And I would argue you need a reason to walk, a safe walk, a comfortable walk, and an interesting walk. All pretty straightforward, but it's useful to organize it in this way. A reason to walk has to do with the mixed use that we've already talked about. Jane Jacobs said, no one will ever walk from sameness to sameness, even if the effort expended is minimal. And so the first job in our communities is to create things, to intermix things that you can walk to them from each other. So when looking at any place, and particularly looking at a downtown, where walkability is most possible. Look at the mix that you've got, like you have here on Broadway, and do the ratios. Say what is missing or underrepresented. And then as a community, make a policy decision to try and bring in those things that you're missing and not try to bring in more of what you have abundance of. Secondly, a safe walk has to do, frankly, these days, less about crime and more about cars and about creating places where you feel as a pedestrian you at least have a fighting chance against the automobile. So as I've already said, this is Alexandria. Millions of people come to Alexandria every year in Virginia. Only 2 streets are more than 2 lanes because they're small blocks, so there are small streets and lots of them. This is Coral Gables, Florida, but this idea of many small blocks. And any plan you see for any property that does not have blocks of a certain size, we can tell you the size in the Smart Growth Manual, but they shouldn't be much more than 250 by 600, then it's not going to be a walkable area. So number 1, block size. We know this solution and what this produces. That's what that looks like. Fewer streets, unwalkable. And the sidewalk is there as a reminder of the planner's failure, never occupied except if your engine breaks. And then the number of lanes, as I already discussed, and the width of those lanes. I was asked to do a walkability study for Oklahoma City, which had the honor of being named the least walkable city in America by Prevention Magazine. And we've completely reconfigured their downtown streets. They're building it now over the next 3 years. They're completely rebuilding their 140-acre downtown core because they have lots of money. They have a lot of oil and gas money. So they're spending their oil and gas money to make it more walkable in their downtown, which is lovely. But the number of lanes and the width of those lanes, and you typically arrive in cities, this happens to be Davenport, Iowa, where my wife is from, and you have 13 and 14-foot travel lanes. A car is 6 feet wide. A 13-foot travel lane is a highway with travel lane. It sends the signal, go 70 miles an hour. A 10-foot lane is a typical urban lane that says, go urban speeds, go 25, go 30 miles an hour. So you take these 13 and 14-foot lanes, and wow, now we have all this parking we didn't have before because we've made the lanes the right size. Or let's add a median because we don't need this space and make the street more beautiful. This is, of course, accomplished for the cost of paint alone, so it's much cheaper than doing that. And both solutions are available to us. So here's a typical street in Davenport. The next step is one-ways. One-way streets, and I don't recall seeing too many here, but I'm ready to stand corrected. Most American cities in the 70s and 80s laid in a framework of one-way streets over what was a two-way system. And one-way streets, of course, because there's multiple lanes in the same direction, whichever lane you're in, the other lane seems faster. So you get into this road racer mentality, whereas if you don't have the choice to occupy that other lane, you don't get into that frame of mind. So these are more dangerous from that way. From that perspective, there's less potential for conflict from the other direction. So cars, again, are moving faster. And this huge mass of steel all moving in the same direction makes pedestrians feel less safe. They're also bad for commerce because you can't see now half the stores that you're crossing, that you're passing when you go through an intersection. And most people whose cities have been converted to one-way in the 80s or 70s, mostly the 70s, have stories about the stores that went out of business. And then left-hand turn lanes. This is a state highway, unfortunately, because they set the rule in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And these shops are all dead or dying because this left-hand turn lane, which is 300 feet long, is necessary to turn into a street with 7 houses. It's not necessary, but the DOT decided it was. So the left-hand turn lane arrives, the parallel parking is removed, and the shops can't thrive. So parallel parking is extremely important, both to serve shops, but also as a barrier of steel between the sidewalk and the street edge that makes the street feel safe, as are the street trees, which provide so many benefits, not to this fellow, but they protect the sidewalk, they make pedestrians feel safer. And I'd like to take the opportunity here, because so many cities, it's really hard to monetize the benefits that street trees provide. But if you could document and demonstrate all the things that street trees do, there's not a city in America that wouldn't be investing today in what I call a continuous canopy campaign, to have streets everywhere, to have trees everywhere along every street and touching each other. They absorb a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. They absorb a tremendous amount of rainwater, so that they reduce your requirements for water treatment, which I know is very high in this part of the country. reduce heat island impacts, so that they actually lower neighborhoods that they're in the temperatures by about 8 to 10 degrees typically, and they increase real estate value, typically about $25,000 per home that they're placed in front of per tree. So if there was a way, I guess that one can be achieved through tax. If property values go up, those taxes do come back to the city. So there's about 10 different ways that trees benefit. They make a street under a tree. The asphalt lasts about twice as long as a street that's exposed to sunlight. So there's all these things that trees do that cities need to put on the books in order to make decisions about how many trees to provide. But they also make cars typically go slower and make pedestrians feel safer. And there's this great thing that's hitting more and more cities across America, and you have a few streets that are potentially primed for these, called the road diet. Who's heard this term, the road diet? And the amazing thing about the road diet, I'll show you in a minute, but the motivation is clear. These typical 4-lane roads are extremely unsafe because you want to go left, the immediate car stops for you, and there's another car speeding in the next lane that T-bones you when you try to get across the intersection. And the statistics on these are very bad. What if we were to make it 1 lane in each direction and have a center turn lane? So now there's no more opportunity for conflict. You notice there's room now for bike lanes, which is a nice thing to have in your streets. But the impact on safety is dramatic. 1 injury every 30 days versus 1 injury every 9 days. This is a specific street in Orlando, Florida, but this experience is typical. But here's the shocker. The traffic capacity of the road is not reduced at all. So if anyone here is proposing a road diet for any of your streets, and someone from Public Works or anywhere else says you can't do it because we need the capacity, well, in fact, here are 20 different streets, and you can see 17.7 became 16.7, 1700 became 1700, 2300 became 25,900. It averages out pretty much identical before and after. So this is something you can do tomorrow. That's a safe walk. That's my longest category. Finishing up here. Comfortable walk has to do with the fact that we humans are like all animals, we seek prospect and refuge. We want to be able to see our prey and our predators. We want to know that our back is covered. And so that's why the same highway engineers that are widening your streets, when it comes time for their vacation, they go to places like Split in Croatia because they can hang out in these beautiful places which have edges. And a plaza is only as good as its edges, and a street is only as good as its street walls. And so these are the kind of spaces that draw us. We've been talking about it since the Renaissance. What's the ideal width to height ratio? And what we've pretty much concluded is that beyond 6:1, you don't feel comfortable. You don't feel enclosed anymore. And if you don't feel enclosed, your thousands of year old genes are telling you that you could be eaten. So we're drawn to places like Salzburg and Austria where we can experience this, and we're not drawn to places like Houston where there is no spatial definition. And there's some great examples. For example, this bridge in the other Columbus, that when they rebuilt it over a highway, they got people to walk between two neighborhoods they'd never walked between before because of that feeling of exposure to the highway was solved by creating a street edge, a street wall along this sidewalk with shops. So that's a comfortable walk, and what that points to is, we really need to focus on, in our walkable areas, holding the edges of our streets. And then finally, an interesting walk. This is one thing, this is the same spatially, but on the left and this is the street that connects the two hotels in Grand Rapids, the two best hotels. On the left is a parking garage, and on the right is actually a hotel that was designed, apparently inspired by the parking garage. But we need to be interested, and humans are among the social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans, and so we've learned in places like Charleston that it only takes 25 feet of building to hide 250 feet of garage. And there are these rules that cities are now instituting that you can't expose the edge of a garage to the street, because as nice as it looks, and you've got some nice looking garages downtown, it's boring if there aren't people in it. Or what I call the Chia Pet garage in Miami Beach, where they've preserved the Art Deco storefronts and pushed it back from the edge of the street. And that's the theory. So in your city, and particularly in your downtown or in your sub-centers, where you have an opportunity to bring people together in a walkable realm, the question is how you accomplish that. And the work I've been doing recently in a number of cities, most recently in Lowell, Massachusetts, And by the way, a historic nickname for your city was the Lowell of the South. But I was in the Lowell of the North. And the first rule, as you might imagine, is fix your streets. So take streets that look like this, one-way, fat lanes, all the same direction, and turn them into two-way, road diet, bike lane streets that ultimately are handling the same amount of traffic on a downtown-wide basis. And we're doing that. And then this concept of practicing urban triage, and this is the last point I want to share with you, that pick your winners and reinforce success. A lot of your city will not be walkable, and that's okay. The most walkable cities in America have huge areas that are principally automotive, but you need to figure out where your walkable areas are and make them more so. And most city planners, most city managers, most mayors feel an obligation to sprinkle the fairy dust evenly around their whole city because it's, you are all my constituents, right? I need to serve all of you. But the fact is that spending money for an improved sidewalk or tree plantings in a strip with 4 lanes of road, no parking, and lube joints is not going to turn it into a walkable neighborhood. And you need to spend your money on walkability where walkability is possible. And that's what urban triage is about. Here in Davenport, Iowa, this is a map of ignoring the characteristics of the street. Where do I feel comfortable and interested? And where do I not feel comfortable and interested based on the properties that line the road? From green being an A to red being an F. And from that observation, a pattern emerges of the areas which in green can be walkable very soon, and the areas which in yellow can be walkable before too long. And the areas in white, we're not going to invest a penny in making them more walkable. And we're going to spend the money then, see the correlation between the two diagrams. We're going to spend the money now. Here are a series of interventions, red is short-term and gray is long-term, that are proposed now on private property in combination with the street improvements to turn the unwalkable parts of the downtown into more walkable area. And like any planner, when you put lines on a map, you're not dumb enough to be saying, build this now. What you're saying is, I'm a planner, I'm looking out into the future, because if you don't look into the future, you can't plan. Say, when you build something, this is where it should go. And as a city, and as a community, as a business community, and even the nonprofits in the community need to understand collectively, this is where we want to see things happen first, and we're going to incentivize it as we can. So I've reached the end of my talk. We do have hope that these things, we've seen a tremendous amount of change since the new urbanist movement began, really in earnest around 1980. It has gone from an unknown movement to the dominant movement in the discourse about city planning. In about 20 years that happened. And we look to the environmentalists and Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring in 1962, and how when Silent Spring was written, our environment was not protected. And within about a decade, it was, perhaps some would say, overprotected. The amount of laws that were created and activities that were created to save the environment in a mere decade were tremendous, dramatic, and effective. So we feel let's move it up the food chain a little bit and think about the human environment and what sort of, we know what makes the plants and the animals thrive, but what makes the humans thrive? And I think we've come to understand that it's the traditional neighborhood. And it's this environment which we need to invest in now while still preserving the environment. And in fact, this will help to preserve the environment. But we've learned now, for the humans to be happy, what makes that happen. And we know how to do it. And as Winston Churchill said, you can always trust the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted the alternatives. So thank you very much for your attention.
I am Virginia Peebles, and I too would like to thank you for coming this morning, and especially for our partnership with MidTown Inc. in this endeavor. And Jeff, you certainly gave us thought-provoking and 8 planning ways for the city to move, and how wonderful it would be to have a utopian society where all of our communities were walkable. But we certainly have new ideas and great thoughts, and with humor, I can see how you advise mayors and governors, and we're most appreciative of you coming to Columbus. Thank you.